Good morning, everyone. You know, the hokey half is happening right now, and we already finished it. Good job. I saw some of you out on the trail while I was running very fast, and just great to be in a community full of runners who... Just kidding. It's not true. My name is Kelly Shushak, and I'm the pastor here at Edges, and I come because I can't believe God changes anything by myself. But I come here and I look at you and I know your stories that God has changed everything for some of you. And it reminds me that it's okay to believe. It's okay to trust again, to hope again. So I'm glad we all came. I wanted to process something out loud with you this morning. I wondered if any of you have noticed this pervasive attitude that I've been seeing a lot lately. I'll give you a couple of examples. This past week, I was in my favorite local grocery store. I'm there every day. I see many of you there. We can vouch for one another. So while checking out, I had a conversation with one of my usual checkers. And I said, "How's it going?" Like I always do. And she just shook her head. So I said, "Oh, sorry, long day." And she said, "That's the only kind there is." So we both stood in this awkward silence for a moment, not really knowing what to do. And then she said, "Literally, it feels to me like the clock turns backward here every day." And then there's my phone, and it's been blowing up. And I've been getting texts this week from a friend, and she can't find her hope lately. Actually, I've known her for over 20 years now, and every single year of her life has been hard. Anyway, she had been remembering in this text string with me how worry has always consumed her. In fact, she was telling me about how when she was a child, she couldn't even play when she was a little girl because it felt useless to her. She felt like she needed to spend her time worrying. So her closing text to me in this particular string this week said, "Anxiety out of whack, prayers please." And then I went to my trainer 3 times this week. This is my athletic trainer, not because I'm athletic, as if I needed to tell you that. not because I'm athletic, but because I have a brittle bone problem and the doctor says I need to go. So we're in the middle of my workout, and she asks me, "What kind of a kid were you?" And I said, "Why?" And she said, "I think you might have been a tantrum child." And I said, "What do you mean?" And she said, "Well, every time I tell you to do something, the first words out of your mouth are, 'No, I will not.'" It's just funny how you always start from that same place, she says. So here's my beginning question for us this morning. Have you had interactions with people lately who, for whatever reason, and there's a whole spectrum on this one, like the examples that I just gave to you, who for whatever reason seem like their close to empty light is on when it comes to joy? Have you had interactions with anybody lately who, for whatever reason, seem like their close to empty light is on when it comes to joy? So what I'd like to invite you to do this morning is share just one brief snippet together with a group of people about someone for whom this is true. Now, you use your judgment. If you need to omit names here, feel free to do so. When we talk together at Edges in groups, we often get in groups of 5 or 6. That helps the conversation to flow. When we do that, if you don't know the people who are in your group, just say your name first, and then anybody who wants to share an example, a quick snippet, about somebody who seems like they're running low on joy, who's in your life. Why don't you take a few minutes to do that? It'll give us a good starting place. Go. All right, let whoever's talking, go ahead and finish up. All right, let's see if we can bring it back in this way. I think that's the kind of question I can tell by watching the groups talk that it's one you could have talked about all day long. Everybody knows somebody who's on E for the joy meter. Many of us know ourselves are also in that place. So what I'd like to do first this morning is ask you to remember the examples that you just shared, the ones also that you're thinking of inside yourself. With those examples in mind today, we're going to begin something new. Based on what I think I'd call a developing hope from our last series. It was a series called The Good Book on whether or not the Bible can do anything real for us. Based on that developing hope, we're going to actively test a hypothesis together over the next several weeks. Our hypothesis: studying the Bible makes our lives more relevant. That's the hypothesis. Studying the Bible makes our lives more relevant. So today we begin. I hope you'll be able to join us for the next 4 weeks, because I have a sense that what we're going to find together will be incremental and communal and cumulative. Sort of like a slow walk together where we wind up someplace different than the place where we are now. So where do we start to test the hypothesis that studying the Bible makes our lives more relevant? Well, I chose Philippians as the place for us to start because, first of all, it's a good example of a really accessible genre of the Bible. So the Bible has prophecy, not too accessible. The Bible has poetry. The Bible has law within it. The Bible has lament. The Bible has lots of different genres. And there's this one category of the Bible that is in the category called correspondence. Literally letters. Letters from one party to another. So Philippians, the book I've chosen, is a letter. 21 of the 66 books in the Bible are correspondence, are letters. So like almost a third of the genres that we have in the Bible fall into this category. It would be good to learn how to read them, right? So I chose this letter because, all said and done, this letter is about joy. And I figure when looking around, joy is something that we could all use more of. So in keeping with the hypothesis I mentioned earlier, I wondered if in studying this book, this letter to the Philippians, I wondered if God could make our lives more relevant in the joy category. Who needs that? Well, I do. Clearly, my trainer would say. My friend who's never been able to play does. The grocery store checker does. The people who you talked about around your tables do. I suspect many of us in the room also do. Seems to me like lots of people are walking around on what seems like a permanent E in the joy tank. So I'd like for us to think together about this letter that we have access to called Philippians. I know it's found inside a big thick book called the Bible, but I'd like for you to try to think of it in letter form. So say someone who you trust hands you a letter. And the letter is to and from people you don't know. And this friend tells you that they want you to read it, that the contents might be helpful to you. So before you would read the letter, what are some of the things you need to know first? Go ahead, call them out. Context. What else? Who's it to? Who's it from? Why? Why is it written, or why would it be helpful? Both. Why'd they write it? Why would it be helpful for me? What else? Somebody hands you a random letter, says, here, this is going to be helpful for you. What do you need to know?
Where'd they get it?
Where'd it come from? What do you think I need help with? The first group said, why do I care? Is it that same feeling? Yeah.
How long will it take me to read it?
Yeah. How long will it take me to read it? And it implied, is it worth my time?
Do I have to pass it on?
Oh. Do I need to pass it on? Excellent questions. Sorry? When? When was it written? Good starting places. You should always ask this about any letter that you've been given that somebody thinks would be helpful for you, including all 21 of the ones in the Bible genre. Great starting places. So in short, kind of summarizing what all you said and what the first group said, it really helps you to know something about the relationship between the two parties, because that can help you to establish a beginning relevance for the letter. And then you will be helped to decide whether or not there are any overlaps between their relationship or their experiences or their circumstances and your own. That's how you can begin to decide if it's going to be helpful for you. So when it comes to the Bible, there's really good news. There are great places to get this kind of information. This kind of information about the Bible really is plentiful. Anybody can access stuff that's related to context, to use the word Frank said. But I never knew much about this until I went to seminary. So I was always just sort of stuck with a random letter, wondering what in the world it was good for. So this morning I'd like to invite you to know some things that they were keeping a secret, apparently, until you go to seminary. One is that you can get a Bible called a study Bible. If you didn't know this, you should. And in a study Bible, there will be helps, little things in front of the books that will tell you the when, the where, the to, and the from, and some of the historical context. And it'll give you a different view from which to read the letter. One that I recommend is called the Wesley Study Bible. There are plenty of others out there. Just if you're looking for a place to start, that might be a good one. And you can get them online. I have a couple of extras in my office if you'd like to borrow them. Also, in Edges, we typically read from a version of the Bible called the Common English Bible. It's not the only great version of the Bible. It's one that's pretty straightforward and pretty true to the original context. That's why we use it. But again, there are other great ones. And let me make a quick plug that if you don't have a Bible, out front Justice will have some after worship. Just take one. It's yours. They're black and they look like this. You'll be happy to have one if you don't. Okay, so you could start there with a study Bible. If you're really interested after that, or really confused, there's something called commentaries. Commentaries are books written about the Bible by scholars. And one great place for you to find a commentary is online. You can go to BibleGateway.com, and there are several free commentaries along with Scripture that you can just click on, and it'll show you what scholars have said about the text that you're reading. It's very helpful. If you don't like online, or you just like hard books like me, then you can get the real live commentaries like this, the books. And one place you can get these is in our church library, which I'm sure you didn't even know we had. We do, and it's full of commentaries. And you might be surprised to find out that there's never any line waiting for them. One thing I want to say to you as I close this commercial is that commentaries are like everything else. You can find conservative commentaries and liberal commentaries, and it's your job to use your brain to figure out what to do with that. There's something such as partisan theology that you can do after you read lots of liberal and conservative commentaries. So just keep reading, and you'll find a space that'll begin to feel like truth and wisdom as you move through. So, now, I'm sort of intuitive, and I can tell from your faces that that might sound boring to some of you. But I want you to know that when I did this exercise, I did it thinking about preparing for God to make it come to life. And here's what I found. The letter is from one friend to his church family. The friend, Paul, no longer lives close by, so he's had to leave this little church. In fact, he's probably about 800 miles away in a place called Rome. So he's writing to them at a great distance. So this little community, though, the Philippian community, they can imagine what it's like for Paul in Rome, because they live in Philippi, which is a Roman colony. So they're both under the same rule. They both have the same customs. They both share many of the same things. They both live in places that are full of Roman culture and Roman government. And what that means is that they're both in situations where there's a mandatory allegiance to the emperor. King worship is mandatory. And it's a forced allegiance. It has to be forced because the conditions in which the people live are often unfair and oppressive and seemingly permanent. Everybody's stuck in the places where they are. Now would be a good time to stop and see if you can make any correlations. Even so, even though they were living in those times, when Paul was with them in Philippi, before Paul left, it was a golden time. They started a little church together, and that little church had a hodgepodge of unlikely people. You can read the biblical text and learn that literally there were slaves and there were rich business owners, and they became each other's family in this little church. In a culture where they couldn't find that anyplace else. And so they created tons of memories, common stories. They had new babies. They found new futures. There were house parties everywhere. It was the stuff that makes miracles and hope and healing when they were together. But then Paul leaves. And soon thereafter, the community, the little Philippian community, they get word that Paul has been arrested. Most versions will tell us that Paul's been imprisoned. Historically, it was more likely that he was under something sort of like house arrest. But it was for a capital offense. So it wasn't like house arrest where you're going to get some community service and be fine. It was house arrest awaiting something pretty critical, pretty dire. So it's serious. And they learn that he's under arrest for living his faith in a way that doesn't toe the political line. Imagine that. So, how do you think the community feels when they get the word about Paul? That's what I'm wondering. How do you think the Philippi community feels when they get the word that Paul's in prison for living his faith in a way that doesn't toe the political line? What are some of the words you would use to describe how they might feel? Angry. Disheartened. Anxious. Fearful. Okay, we'll start there. Probably all of those things and more. So now everybody in the little church's joy tank is on empty. Just thinking about their friend and mentor, Paul, right? So they're distressed or angry, disheartened, anxious, fearful, divided maybe. And so, not knowing what else to do, this community starts a GoFundMe campaign. And after they raise the money, they vote on Epaphroditus, who they had to choose just because his name was so long. They vote for Epaphroditus to go all the way to Rome to take the money to Paul. And he agrees. So Epaphroditus gets the money, puts it in a pouch, and starts out to go toward Paul, all because this little community loves and wants to be helpful to their friend. So now, try to envision what it is to be Epaphroditus. Try to envision walking or riding some kind of animal for 800 miles, all the while thinking about what it's going to be like when you find your friend who may get killed and who's under arrest. What are you going to say? I don't know how much you guys do this, but I do this kind of thing all the time. Walk into situations like this where the circumstances are dire and the people on the other side of the door are in trouble, real trouble. And really, that kind of thing will shake you. I'm often outside someone's home in my car trying to brace myself for what I'm going to find on the other side of the door, just waiting for the right words to come. And they never do. We just have to go in. Now, what do you think Epaphroditus will walk into when he finds Paul? What do you think Paul's like on the basis of what you know so far? What would you be like? Stressed. Helpless. I'm going to wait for you on this one. Bitter. Thank you. Tired. Hopeless. Hopeless. Lonely. Uncertain. So we know that this letter is both to and from people who are angry, disheartened, anxious, fearful, stressed, helpless, bitter, tired, hopeless, lonely, and uncertain. If you've ever been any of those things, maybe you should read the letter. The letter that we have here, the letter to the Philippians, is what Epaphroditus walked into. Let me explain. The door to the house opens. The two greet. And after a cold drink, or a warm one, maybe it was winter, they begin to catch up. They tell a whirlwind of stories. And after some time, I imagine a worn-out Epaphroditus saying, man, I got to turn in. I got to go to bed. It's been a long journey. But Paul can't sleep. He can't stop thinking about all that Epaphroditus has brought him. The money, the prayers, the reminders of friendship, the stories from the people he loves. And Paul misses his people. Lonely probably is a good guess. And so in time, we don't know exactly how much time, Paul sits and writes this letter. Can you see what having a little context can do for you? So the letter is found on page 673 in the Bibles that are on your tables, if you'd like to follow along. Otherwise, the exact scriptures that we'll tackle today will be on the screen, but having more context may help some of you. Paul writes, I thank my God every time I mention you in my prayers. I'm thankful for all of you every time I pray. And it's always a prayer full of joy. What? So this guy, who would be totally justified in panicking, is instead praying. And when he prays, he's not even talking about himself. He's not self-consumed. From the middle of his awful circumstance, he is not focused on Paul. He's talking about his friends. And that conversation that Paul is having with God takes him beyond his own circumstances to a place of joy. I don't know if I believe that. He remembers also, he then remembers what it means to him to have people who you can count on to live with faith with you. And then he says, verse 6, I'm sure about this. Now, I can just imagine him here. I am not sure about hardly anything. Everything has changed. I'm sure about nothing hardly, except this one thing. I am sure about this. The one who started a good work in you will stay with you to complete the job. So here's Paul, their trusted friend, who should be running scared from all the good work they used to do together because it's about to get him killed. Who should justifiably declaring this faith thing a failed experiment. He'd be justified in doing so. It has not worked out well for him. And this guy is saying with absolute certainty, God has this, guys. Let's stay the course. Don't you ever forget that your life is meant for this kind of good work. Nobody can stop that. And then verse 9. This is my prayer. I read it like, this is my exact prayer. That your love might become even more and more rich with knowledge and with all kinds of insight. I pray this so that you will be able to decide what really matters, and so you will be sincere and blameless on the day of Christ. Paul, who should be silent and totally solitary right now, consumed with himself, is praying that they will have energy and courage, that they will have more energy and more courage to run toward more love with each other, with strangers, with enemies, in the face of corrupt power, that they will have more energy to run toward their own faith. He tells them this love will be the thing that will help them figure everything out. This is going to be the thing that makes it all make sense. How could he say this? Somehow Paul has learned that love is the good action that cannot be stopped. And Paul has the circumstances to back that up. It's not like it's easy. It should be otherwise. The circumstances point to otherwise. And then if you read the text, you'll hear this story about how even in jail, Paul just found a bunch more people to love. Seriously, that's the story. You can read it. So Paul's in jail and he just found a bunch more people to love, like a captive audience, literally. And Paul is having the time of his life. So Paul knows that practicing love will help them decide what really matters. He knows in his bones that you can be under house arrest facing death and still be untouchable. Can you imagine the freedom? You can still be under house arrest and be untouchable. Sincere and blameless is what he calls it. In the only way that counts. You'll still be sincere and blameless. So Paul's trying to show and to shout to them about a total perspective shift that is possible no matter our circumstances. Who needs that? Then, in verses 12 to 26, you can look at it later, Paul tells them a true story. He talks about how God can engineer a shift in perspective even through awful stuff, like when you've got a possible death sentence in your future, like when you can see no future. And when God gives you peace and grace and opportunities to keep on loving when you should be paralyzed, that will bring life to you and to everyone around you. I mean, this stuff is hard to believe. Paul's intention in summary is this. Listen, if circumstances should put you in a place where you are running on empty in the joy tank, have you considered that God might help shift your perspective as a solution? And then in this letter, Paul's saying, I know it's true because God is doing it for me right now in real time. There's nothing like the story of a friend right now in real time who you trust. So, here's how it happens if we want to take our cues from Paul's letter. If you are out when it comes to joy, or if you know people who are, here are some perspective shifters according to Paul. Things we can glean from the parts we've just studied. Number one, talk to God. Paul didn't stop talking to God, and instead of whining or demanding, which is what I would be doing and what he should be doing, remember past joy. Start with remembering the memories of when God gave you joy before. Now let me just ask you before we go to the next one, just in your minds, what good would that do? If you're in the middle of a trench and you decided to practice this, what good would it do? Can you imagine? Number two, remember people who help you love and live with faith. That's what he's doing. Remembering the people who helped him to love and to live with faith. Most of us, when we're in the middle of a trench, we're in the middle of a trench with some pretty hard people. Or all by ourselves. What would remembering the people who helped us to love and live with faith do? Number three, tell those people. Oh, now you've got something to really do. Tell them. If you're doing that, what would that keep you from not doing? That's what I was thinking about. Taking yourself to a different place of action. That's what Paul was doing. Number four, pray big stuff for them. Pray huge stuff for other people. You can't believe God's helping you. Pray stuff for the people who you love. That's what Paul's doing. Number five, don't forget to notice as your own perspective begins to shift. That's the way you believe. When something happens in you that you know you couldn't do yourself. I get the sense as Paul writes the whole letter that he's as surprised as anybody else by what's happened. He can't believe he's feeling what he's feeling either. He just took little steps one at a time. All right, we're going to stop at the end of chapter 1 for this week. But already today, we've only talked about just a few of the things that we could have found there together. Stuff God might want to bring to life. So, I want to urge you to go back and see what else jumps off the page for you this week. Why? Because this isn't the Kelly Show. This isn't where I come and tell us what Philippians says. This is where together we struggle with fear and trembling to find our own salvations. So I just invite you to go and look this week. See what other perspective shifters you notice that we haven't found here together today. And if you send them to me from chapters 1 or 2 this week, we'll just add it to our perspective shifter list and we'll print it up. Put it on the screen next week. Numbers 6, 7, 8, 14, 19, however many you find. Send them to me and we'll keep a cumulative list. But I want to close with one final observation that jumped out at me this past week. It's about how a shift in our perspective, about how when God shifts our perspective, you're not going to believe this. Paul says that has the ability to rattle the status quo. So do you remember in the background info in this passage? Do you remember that I talked about how there's tension in the public square? And that tension is because oppression and injustice are prevalent. The politics of power are problematic. It was true then. It is true now. It is true. The politics of power are problematic. Within that seemingly unstoppable system, Paul tells his friends that the way they are living their faith has made them become a real threat to power. Who needs that? We know that because he says this in verse 29. God has generously granted to you the privilege not only of believing in Christ, but also of suffering for Christ's sake. That's a bunch of words that don't go together. Generously granted you the privilege of suffering? They're suffering because the powers have gotten word that they're living with an alternative vision. They must be chipping away at the political machine. Why else would anyone be trying to put a stop to them? When you're a threat like that, people determined to maintain the status quo are going to start making things difficult for you. So Paul says it's an honor when the way you live begins to shake any wrongful system enough that the system wants to stop you. Paul says believing Christ and following that vision has the ability to rattle the status quo, and that is a privilege. So I don't know about you, but I've been wondering if there's anything strong enough to stop pervasive political power everywhere that it's headed in the wrong direction. Has anybody been wondering that? Paul says living with an alternative perspective will do even that. Oh my, what if that's true? What if the attitude and perspective that we wake up with and that we take into the world, what if that perspective has the ability to actually affect things in the public sphere? Things like who gets to live where? Who gets to love whom? Things like how we're going to take care of our world. Or how we're going to ensure that those with the least have access to the most. What if instead of despondency or anger or defensiveness or bitterness or rage, what if something as innocent as developing joy is an answer that God is offering to inhabit? So let it be. Amen.